Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share some of the research results with you. I've never been to this meeting before, so it's an exciting time for me. Really appreciate you coming today. So as George just mentioned, Jeff was the original project leader on this, and I've assumed those roles, but a lot of people have contributed to this, and we'll go over that at the end. So this is focused on nutritional strategies for gilts. And so why is that? And so this is a slide that Mark Boggess put together a number of years ago when he was still at the National Pork Board. Mark is now our center director at Meat Animal Research Center there in Nebraska. And he's got sow lifetime productivity at the center of this matrix. This is an effort to try to explain the complexity of sow lifetime productivity. That you have a lot of players. They have direct effects, they have indirect effects through interactions between themselves. And you'll notice out here, gilt development's way out here at the edge. It's a secondary factor. And I think this typifies how people have traditionally thought about gilt development, right? And I think a comment was made Saturday. We've always thought about gilts as being fairly cheap. But it takes her 2.5, 3 parities to make up the cost of her raising, so it's not necessarily cheap. And so what we propose is that gilt development is a driver of sow lifetime productivity. We really need to think about gilt development in the center of this complex matrix. And so Jenny's already talked to you about some things like litter of origin. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nutrition as well. So a different perspective on gilt development, if you will. So we've already talked about this. We really want early sexual maturity in our gilts. It's critical for our sow lifetime productivity. We know that age at puberty, or that first HNS, is the first indicator that we have that a gilt of her potential reproductive potential. This is important because we know that age at puberty is positively associated to other indicators of fertility and productivity involved in sow lifetime productivity, including they're more fertile at each estrus and each subsequent farrowing. They have shorter weaned estrus intervals, more regular farrowing intervals. They're less likely to be culled for reproductive reasons, and they typically accumulate fewer non-productive days. And Jenny just went over some of this. They stay in the herd longer, and they tend to produce more pigs, not over just their lifetime, but at each farrowing. So I think it's an important indicator, and one of the few reproductive traits that is moderately heritable. And so I think that is an important consideration as well. So these are data from Daniel Chibando's lab at the University of Nebraska. What he's showing you here is age at puberty on the x-axis and the probability of generating either a first or second litter on the y-axis. And there's 3 different color lines here. Those just represent 3 different genotypes. That's not what we want to talk about today, but the top lines are the probability of generating a first parity, and the bottom lines are the probability of generating a second parity. And what you see is the relationship between age at puberty, earlier sexually maturity in gilts leads to a greater probability of those generating not a first but also a second litter as well in your herd. So that's why we have a lot of focus on age at first HNS in these projects. And so this is data that Jenny has generated a number of years ago that just shows that puberty occurs over a wide range of growth rates and backfat thicknesses. So this makes it a challenge just to use some of these measures as an indicator of a gilt's potential. In general, gilts with the highest growth rates accumulate more backfat. Okay, they tend to cycle earlier. As a general rule, we want gilts to have greater than 600 grams a day, or about 1.1 pound per day of lifetime growth rate from birth to selection. And as Jenny just mentioned, the target breed on these gilts, we want to breed them somewhere between 135 and 150 kilos. That's an optimal weight range to avoid some of those larger gilts. So these are data that were generated in in some of the earlier trials on this project, and it shows the growth potential of gilts. And so here we have lifetime growth rate from birth to bore stimulation, and this line here represents that 600 grams a day kind of threshold line. You can see very few gilts showed an HNS if they didn't have that level of growth rate. What we've got here is age at puberty in days, and you can see age at puberty occurred over a very wide range. And these vertical dash lines here between 170 and 200 days of age was that kind of optimal time that we need to have gilts with an HNS in order to get them into the herd on target. So a lot of gilts don't make that. They're showing estrus out here. And what I try to do, this illustrates that what Jenny was just talking about, gilts greater than 140 kilograms at first estrus. They're likely to be greater than 150 kilos at breeding, and that represents all these gilts to the right of this diagonal line out here are at risk for being too heavy at breeding. And we know that those gilts are heavier throughout their entire life. They're higher risk for lameness and injury. They have a higher maintenance cost in terms of feed, and they tend to be culled earlier due to reproductive problems as well as lameness, and they have lower overall lifetime productivity. So this illustrates the issue. We got gilts that are very large. So again, this is data out of Daniel's lab at University of Nebraska, same kind of thing, age at puberty, and this is the probability of generating a P1 litter. They got two treatments here, an ad lib fed group or an energy restricted group. So when we talk about feeding gilts, people typically feed them ad lib. Recommendations out there are oftentimes to slow their growth at some point in time. And so this is an 85% of the energy, so it's a 15% energy restriction. So what we have here is a probability of generating a parity 1, parity 2, or parity 3, and the effect of diet. So there was no effect of diet on generating a parity 1, but gilts that were on the energy restricted diet had a greater probability of having a second or third litter. So it illustrates a number of things. First, when we talk about gilt development, we kind of either stop at HNS or we stop thinking about it after that first parity. And really, proper gilt development is accumulation of a lot of small things that provide small advantages at each step, and that begins to show up the further into production that you go. So we kind of have to have a long-term view of gilt development. So with this in mind, the Pork Board created the Sow Lifetime Productivity Research Consortium, and they generated a number of questions that we addressed. I'm not going to show all of those to you today, but one of the things that they wanted to know is what is the long-term benefits of reducing growth of gilts during development? What are the diets that are best to use? And this evaluation had to have some stipulations. It needed to be done in commercial conditions with large number of animals, under ad libitum, access to feed, and it had to use diets that had practical ingredients that were readily used and readily available. So Chris Hostetler at the Pork Board led a kind of an informal industry survey to see what are people out there in the industry actually feeding gilts, and what he found was that the typical metabolizable energy in a diet is somewhere between 32 and 33 kilocalories per kilo. And SID lysine is about 1.1% down to about 0.8% to finish a ration. So we use these data to generate 6 different diets. We called our control diet the 100 lysine, 100 ME, and I've got ME and lysine here, so that's this diet. And then we either tried to increase the ME by about 15% or we reduced it by about 15%. It turns out it's very hard to get that big spread. We wound up about 12% really is where we wound up. And then we tried to do that with either hold an SID lysine at that 1%, or we tried to reduce it further by about another 15%. So these diets were fed. These gilts were born in Utah. They were shipped to Iowa. They were placed at weaning into 2 grow-finished barns. Here you can see a picture of that. We had about 1,200 gilts on these study, and we fed them between 100 and 260 days of age. Then they were shipped, and it was a slaughter study, and we looked at reproductive development. About 18 gilts per pen, where we could monitor feed intake, body growth, and composition. And so what we found was that there was no effect of diet on body weight. And so in these graphs, the solid lines are the 100% lysine group, our control lysine levels. The dashed lines are our reduced lysine levels. And then the orange lines are reduced ME, and the blue lines are our control ME, and then the purple lines are our high ME diets. And so maybe a little bit of spread out here at the end, but no significant differences. And so why was that? Why did that occur? If we look at backfat, one of objectives of this study was to try to increase backfat on these gilts, and the high ME diets resulted in about a 10% increase in backfat. There's some question, is that enough, or is that biologically relevant? But very little chance to increase backfat here. So what happened? If we look at average daily feed intake, again, the orange lines are the low ME diets, the purple lines are the high ME diets. As you reduced metabolizable energy in the diet, pigs compensated by eating more feed to meet their metabolizable energy requirement for growth. And you say, duh, right? You would expect that. But I will point out, we had a lot of nutritionists, both on the task force as well as the Lifetime Consortium group, that really felt that pigs couldn't adjust it that much. And so I think pigs are really resilient. And as a consequence, there was no difference in metabolizable energy intake. So I think it may seem self-evident now, but there's limited opportunity just to reduce energy content in a diet and alter the composition of growth of gilts in a meaningful way. The reduced lysine, we were able to reduce lysine, and this failed to affect growth and development, and it suggested potentially that we could reduce lysine in the diet of developing gilts. So Jenny's already shown you these data, but these were the puberty data. I just want to show you a little bit about reproductive development on this portion of the project. What we did here is in the first 40 days of boar exposure, and I'll show you why I picked 40 days, because that kind of lines up with the subsequent studies. We got about 75% of our gilts with an HNS during that first 40 days of boar exposure, which is reasonably good. And by 220 days of age, which in this production system is when PG600 would be given, we got quite a number of gilts. Almost all the gilts were at the acceptable age at puberty, and Jenny kind of broke those down for you. This would be our non-select gilts that we really wouldn't want to put in a population. So it's that kind of first 1 and 2 waves in this particular system that we were worried about. Reproductive development. So I've got age at puberty here. There was no significant difference in diet on age at puberty, probably not surprising given the lack of effects on growth rates and body composition. We did slaughter these pigs. We didn't see any difference in ovulation rates on these gilts. We looked at the ovary both gross and histologically, as well as the uterus, both gross and histologically, and there was no effects on development of those tissues. So we backed up a little bit and said, okay, well, we need to take a more strategic approach to this. And so in trials 2 and 3, we developed 3 diets, what we call a high lean, a medium lean, and a low lean growth. Sometimes we refer to these as high lysine or low lysine because we reduced the level of lysine in these diets even further. So this high lean growth is kind of that 85% lysine diet from the first trial, really. And as we did that, we increased fiber in the diet by adding wheat midds and corn germ to try to compensate and prevent the gilts from being able to adjust their feed intake. And then we kept energy up by adding grease. And so this was done actually in Utah. So the gilts were born in Utah. They stayed in Utah. They were assigned to pens. There was 24 gilts in a pen at weaning, and that becomes relevant when we talk about boar exposure here in just a little bit. And we did block by litter of origin effect. As Jenny just said, we've done a lot of study led by Jeff Lay at the Research Center that shows colostrum intake is important. So we did block by litter. So we had litter mates in the 3 treatments. So a couple of differences in the 2 trials. We did this preliminary trial with about 600 gilts just to make sure our diets were going to work the way we thought they were. And we fed these gilts from 100 to 220 days of age. And then in trial 3, we had a much larger, this was what we call kind of our main trial, 3,000 gilts. So our goal was 1,000 gilts on each treatment. And we only fed up to 200 days of age because at that point they were moved to the sow farms and they were then placed on a gestation diet. And I'll explain that. Maybe I won't explain that. So I will tell you about that. So they either, depending on what farm they went to, they either went into an additional kind of feeder finisher GDU, I guess. I don't really know how to explain that, but where they had ad libitum access to a gestation diet. Or in some farms, they went straight into the stalls where they had about 4 pounds per day access to gestation diet. And so in farms where they had a GDU, they went to the breed line 10 days before their expected breed date. So looking at average daily gain here, the blue line is our high lean growth, the purple line is our medium lean growth, and the red line is our low lean growth. The Gilts in the high lean growth trial gained the most weight. The Gilts on the low diet gained the least amount of weight. But this is still a very acceptable growth rate in terms of being able to get those pigs large enough to meet our breeding targets. We did see differences in lysine intake, as was expected, but the addition of fiber really limited the pig's ability to adjust intake in this study, so we didn't see any differences in feed intake or ME intake in this experiment. I think a couple of mentions, it gets hard to weigh Gilts. We did look at individual body weights, and again, the high growth Gilts weighed more. We looked at other measures of body, I call it body size. That might not be the right term. We did a flank-to-flank measure, and you can see the high-growth Gilts had the highest flank-to-flank measure. It was pretty similar between the medium and the low-growth Gilts. We used the caliper that developed at North Carolina State. I know a lot of people are using this now, where they kind of have this thin, ideal, and fat kind of range for breeding pigs as an estimate of fat cover. What we see is the high-growth Gilts had the highest measures and the low-growth Gilts had the lowest measures, and I didn't get this on the right slide. But what I'll point out here is that this kind of range, where you start to get into ideal, is about 12 millimeters of back fat here, or 12 arbitrary units on this scale. And all our Gilts were already at that threshold by the time they were 200 days of age before we shipped them to the farm. So add another 20 to 40 days on there, 20 to 30 days, and we'd expect those Gilts to be easily in the ideal to fat range on that caliper, I think. So the point here is that these measures were useful in identifying the larger and the smaller Gilts. Okay, if you can't weigh them. There's other methods, as just George mentioned. He has a tape as well. And if we look at back fat, the high growth Gilts had the most back fat, and the low and medium Gilts had very similar levels of back fat. Although when we look at loin depth, the Gilts on the low diet had the lowest loin depth and the lowest fat-free lean. So we looked at fat-to-lean ratio as a measure of body composition. So the high diet had the most back fat and the most muscle, but when you look at a fat-to-lean ratio, they had lower fat-to-lean ratio than the Gilts on the low diet. So that means that the Gilts who were fed the low-growth diet were proportionately fatter than the other two groups. And so the question is, does that provide a benefit to them? So we were able to successfully alter growth rates and body composition of Gilts in development, but we have to add fiber to do that. So what we'd say, you have to add something, you either physically limit access to feed, or you have to have some intake limiter in your diet to achieve that. Despite the fact that we really reduced lysine quite a bit, we still achieved sufficient growth rates and body composition of Gilts for good reproductive performance. And then I already mentioned the alternative measures of body fat or body weight, I think, are useful if those are what are available to you. So bore stimulation proceeded very similar to before. And so we began at 160 days of age. Why 160 days? Because one of the objectives of the experiment was to try to understand physiological maturity. So separating age from physiological maturity. And if you want to know physiological maturity of your Gilts, at least sexually, the literature would say you start heat checking about 140 days of age to get a good separation. That's not very practical, and so 160 days of age was really the kind of the most practical time that we could do this and still get some measure of that. So That's the reason for that. We did use vasectomized boars. They did have 10 minutes of daily contact in the pens, full daily contact. I say that's probably a minimum, as we talked about on Saturday. Probably need, for maximal stimulation, you need more than that. Boars had to run through 4 pens a day. There was between 20 and 24 gilts in a pen. That's probably too much. We'd like it to be closer to about 15. And then we rotated the boars daily among the pens so they didn't see the same gilts every day, and then we rested them every other day. So record keeping, Gilt's got a daily estrus score, 0 being no estrus and 3 being a full standing reflex, and then they were moved at farms. So any gilt that didn't have HNS by 200 days of age, they got bled by 210 and 220 days of age, and we measured progesterone in the serum to determine whether or not we had just missed them or they were truly prepubertal. And then if a gilt hadn't had an HNS by 220 days of age, she received PG600 and were monitored for estrus response. Give you an idea of the gilt flow. I thought this slide was in earlier. So once they left the GDU, half the group entered sow farm 3, where they went into pens in the GDU, ad lib feed. We mentioned that with the stalls 10 days before breeding. And then they were in stall gestation. In sow farm 2, they entered stalls immediately, 4 pounds per day of feed. They were in pen gestation either between 30 to 70 days after we bred them. This farm was adding pen gestation, and so we started out, they didn't go to pens till 70 days, and then we ended up going to pens at 30 days after 32 to 35 days after preg check. So, give you an idea. There is a difference between these farms statistically in the model, but I'm not going to show you that. I'm just going to try to give you an overview. This is frequency distribution for what I call age at first natural heat. So these are non-PG600 induced heats. So these are natural response to boars for high, medium, and low. The dashed line represents the first 40 days of boar exposure when we're in the research GDU, and then when we go to the sow farm. And so there was, you can see gilts start to trickle in. The data would show, the literature would tell us if you want to maximize response to boar stimulation, you wait out here at about 170, 180 days. And I think, if we'd have went out here, we'd have seen more of a response. But nonetheless, we do have a treatment difference in terms of response. Gilts in the high lysine diet responded more to boars sooner than gilts in the medium or low lysine diet during that first 40 days. But it's still not, it's not adequate, and this represents a problem. I think in terms of boar stimulation and boar power in this study, we didn't have enough boar power, I don't think, enough daily stimulation as well in terms of time. And as I mentioned, if we'd have delayed onset of boar stimulation, I think we'd have got a better response here as well. So when we moved them to a farm, you see we got this real response to moving. So in the GDU, the farm had a GDU, gilt stimulation continued as was the case. If she had stalls, they just had boar contact in front of the stalls, and there really wasn't a lot of time there invested. What I'm showing you here is the data in this red box is the data over here. You then come in here and give PG600 to clean up, and we get a big response to PG600. So we got 3 kind of waves of gilts. The first to respond to boars, and then these gilts had adequate growth, adequate body composition, but they didn't respond to boars. They needed extra stimulation, and then you get the ones that are just really not responsive and need PG600. If we look at the two trials with these diets, the first trial we showed that there was gilts on the high diet reached puberty at slightly earlier than the gilts in the low diet, but the way gilts were managed in the second study, age at puberty really wasn't significant. So I don't think that just age at puberty is important, but from onset of boar stimulation to puberty is really, I think, a more important measure in these studies. Gilts with a natural estrus, only about 35% of our gilts in our trial 1 had a natural estrus. We had a PDV outbreak coincident with the beginning of boar exposure. We had 9 weekly groups in that study. We delayed the first group 1 week, and then all the other groups remained on schedule. But growth rates really weren't slowed down that much, but we clearly had a negative impact on sexual development. And these gilts just didn't reach puberty. In our second trial, we had about 55% of gilts showed natural estrus. This is probably pretty similar to what a lot of you see out there. We did have ongoing PD issues at these farms, and as I mentioned, the gilt to boar ratio was probably high. That represents some of that. So, response to PG600, these gilts were really pre-pubertal. Almost 90% of them responded to PG600. A good response. But you can see in the primary trial, as growth rate increased or as the high diet had higher growth rate, higher body weight, the proportion of response to PG600 went down. When we wait this long to apply PG600, and if we look at behavioral and estrus, so pigs that had not shown an estrus record but had ovulated when we looked at progesterone, only about 2% in this study, but closer to 13% in this study, and most of those are in these two groups right here. So there's if you wait that long for PG600 and you got high growth rate gilts, you're going to have a greater incidence of behavioral anestrus, and you reduce the response to PG600, and that makes that PG600 a lot more expensive. So what we learned was that higher growth rate gilts respond to boars sooner at an earlier age at puberty. We already know but we confirmed that. Despite adequate growth and development, the response to boars was inadequate. I think this has important implications for the use of PG600. It emphasizes the importance of gilt stimulation protocols, and I think we underappreciate the effects of disease on reproductive development. I think earlier this morning that somebody said it, one of the presenters said we just kind of consider disease something we live with. And it has a lot of costs, and sometimes we don't understand those costs. Most gilts that require PG600 to stimulate an HNS are truly prepubertal if you use it early enough, but if you delay the use of that, then you have problems with incidence of behavioral anestrus, and that may depend on the growth rate. So I'll wrap up here with just showing you distribution of body weight at HNS. We got body weight here, we got flank to flank measures here, and this was in our trial 2, okay? And we have the 3 different diets distributed out here. And what I've shown you is those optimal weight ranges for HNS that Jenny mentioned earlier. And you can see that the vast majority of our gilts are exceeding that optimal range at first HNS, which means these gilts are going to be they're going to be heavy, right, when you go to breed them. And so that illustrates, I think, some of the issue. So if we look at, this is the primary trial, or trial 3, traits at first breeding. We bred the high growth gilts at a slightly younger age. And despite reduction in growth rates, we hit our breeding targets, right? 300 pounds was our minimal, was our breeding target. We hit those. The high group had a little bit higher back fat at breeding. But if we look at distribution of that weight, again, same kind of thing. 36 inches was our initial target for breeding. And again, we have optimal body weight for breeding, that 135 to 145 kilos of weight. A lot of gilts managed that, got into that, but a lot of gilts fell way below that. And I was initially kind of surprised by that. But you've seen the gilt flow, you've seen how gilts were managed. So if we look at what happens between HNS and breeding, so the solid lines here are gilts that had a natural HNS, so they were younger at HNS. Gilts that had HNS induced by a PG600 are in these striped lines, so they were a bit older when they had their HNS. And then at breeding is shown here in the shaded bars. So the shaded bar has gilts both in this bar and this bar at breeding. So you can see gilts at breeding are still growing, right? They're still gaining flank to flank. They're increasing their fat-free lean, but back fat's reduced. So they're mobilizing back fat. They're becoming leaner. Their fat-to-lean ratio is being reduced in order to take that, whatever you got, gestation diet, 4 or 5 pounds a day, and mobilizing that back fat to maintain that growth. And I think that's a real compromise that needs to be addressed. This is some older data now, but it just shows back fat at selection and then how that impacts litters that are produced for sows and the number of pigs they wean. Reduced back fat at selection when you're going to breeding is associated with reduced litters per sow and reduced pigs wean. And so the question is, do we have to have all this fat on gilts in the GDU to allow us to mismanage them when we get them to the breeding barn? And Jenny talked a little bit about the detriment of sows losing body weight or losing back fat in terms of long-term productivity. You see a little bit of it here as well. So I think that we've got to consider nutritional management of gilts not just during development, but during the breeding, once they go to breeding as well. So I think one of the things we had here was also one of those farms went straight to crates, and you get into heat checking rather than bore stimulation. You don't allow that gilt to have adequate time with the bores. I think that's an issue as well. We really need to have full-on heat bore stimulation there as well. So nutritional management of the gilt doesn't end when we send her to the farm. And I think there may be opportunities to improve gilt development and reproductive performance through management at that level. Yeah, so a lot of acknowledgements, but particularly Ken Stalter and his two postdocs, Julio Calderon-Diaz and Sheena Cuperon, were postdocs and analyzing these data, really important. And the people at Smithfield, Murphy, Brown, Ashley, Dedecker, Christina Phillips, and then the farm tech, Xochitl Martinez and her crew were critical.